good. Well, I will stop sharing this, but as I said, I will leave it open. And Mackenzie by now needs no introduction. So we've had one for her already. So I will go ahead and turn it over to her. And as always, please put your questions up in the chat and we'll get to them towards the end. And feel free to keep this running as you go. Thanks so much.
Myself on. I'm going to try to see if I can not screw up sharing my screen. Can you guys see it?
Looks good. Yeah, it's not.
How about now?
Not, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. So as you guys know, by Mackenzie Case, I work for BSU and I've been helping curate the class. I'm really happy to be giving this talk. This was something, national monuments were something that Dr. Freemuth and I really shared a love for. We were actually working on a book on Craters of the Moon, which I'll talk a little bit about in this presentation, but it's a pretty big topic and I'm going to do my best to summarize the main issues. But I really encourage you guys to do your own research on the topics that I am bringing up. A lot of it is really dense legal stuff. There's a lot of interesting history, and I think there's a lot of interesting things to look out for in the future. So I will start with just a brief overview, National Monuments 101, if you want to call it that. I know we've talked about the Antiquities Act a little bit, but I think the two main passages that become important and really define what the Antiquities Act or don't define it, because it is fairly broad, is that it's meant to protect historic landmarks and the objects of historic or scientific interest. Like I said, that seems fairly broad, and we'll go into that a little bit later. And then the second part that's really important is that they must be managed in the smallest area compatible to actually protect those interests. And that becomes really important with the conflicts that we'll discuss a little bit later. There are 4 sections of the Antiquities Act that are pretty easy to understand. The first section just establishes fines and imprisonment for damaging antiquities. Section 2 establishes the authority to the executive branch or the president to actually establish national monuments. Section 3 is the exact authorization for the executive branch to start permit excavation or examination permits, particularly for artifacts. And then Section 4 just authorizes the executive department, such as the Secretary of Interior, to establish other rules and regulations to properly carry this act out. So again, still fairly broad. I also wanted to start with some interesting facts about national monuments because I think they're a little bit underappreciated. So we think about national parks a lot, and I think that's what gets a lot of media attention and tourism attention. And these are all actually national parks that you probably recognize. So for example, there's Zion, Grand Canyon, Grand Teton, Olympic National Park. Those actually all started off as national monuments, which was something I really didn't even know until probably about 5 years ago. And I never really thought about it. And 4 out of the 5 mighty 5 national parks in Utah actually started off as national monuments. So national monuments can become national parks later. I think I tried to do the calculations, couldn't find an exact statistic, but I think almost half of national parks started out as national monuments, a little under half. There are over 100 national monuments. Again, I think the number is about 128. Sometimes the statistics are hard to find because people tend to mistake National Historic Landmarks or similar designations as national monuments, but I think it's 128. They're typically managed by the following 4 agencies: National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, BLM, and Fish and Wildlife Service, but there can be other federal land managers. They vary from less than an acre, especially for some of the historic national monuments, especially some of the newer civil rights monuments that were designated under Obama and a few under Trump. Also, Statue of Liberty is a national monument, so they're not always what we consider, natural features, or they can be 1 million+ acres. So, for example, a lot of the national monuments in Alaska are over 2 million acres or more. They've been used by many presidents. There's only been 3 presidents after Teddy Roosevelt, who established the act, obviously. And that was Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Nixon, who haven't used the Antiquities Act. They can be marine or terrestrial. I think a lot of people don't know about the marine national monuments, and I'm not an expert on those as well, but those are pretty large, like the Marianas Trench area is a national monument. I think one is almost 60 million acres. And despite the fact that they are protected, multiple uses can be permitted, especially if they're pre-existing uses, including mining claims. Grazing claims are typically grandfathered in when national monuments are established. That's something that I didn't expect when I first started learning about national monuments as well. The power actually rests with the executive and legislative branch. The Antiquities Act gives the executive branch the power to designate national monuments, but they can be designated by Congress as well, just like most other federal protected areas. They must be on existing federally owned or managed land. There's a little leeway with that. For example, if a piece of land is donated to the federal government or the federal government buys a piece of land, that could be incorporated into a national monument, but it can't be designated on private land if that land is still private. It has been used to modify national monuments prior to the controversy with President Trump and Bears Ears and Grand Staircase National Monument, although those have tended to be really small modifications, or they have been enlargements. Idaho doesn't have any national parks, but we do have national monuments. And I really like the history behind Craters of the Moon. This is just an early picture of some explorers looking at Craters of the Moon. And it eventually ended up as an article in National Geographic, which prompted it to become a national monument. A little bit of early history, and there's actually a lot of history it's about 100 years of history or more. So here's a brief timeline through 1980. So in 1700s, 1800s, which also coincided with westward expansion, there was a growing field of archaeology in the United States and public interest in preserving artifacts, especially Native American artifacts in the Southwest. I mentioned the Forest Reserve Act in 1891. The previous speaker, and I can't remember who it was, talked about the Forest Reserve Act, and I just mention it because it's not the first instance that the president has had the authority to designate a protected area. In this case, it was forest reserves, and then eventually a lot of these became national forests. There have also been other archaeological sites designated as protected prior to the Antiquities Act. The one that I know about is Casa Grande, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, ruins, which actually became a national monument later. That was protected via executive order prior to the Antiquities Act. Legislative attempts started in the early 1900s, or 1900 to be exact, to protect antiquities. There were multiple bills that kept failing with Congress. And I thought this was fairly interesting. The two congressmen that really were instrumental in this were actually two from Iowa. I think it was Representative Dollar and eventually another congressman from Iowa, Congressman Lacey, who actually was successful in introducing the act. And that was really helped by anthropologist Edward Lee Hewitt. I think I'm pronouncing that name right. Who actually took him out on a tour of the Southwest, and it really gained public attention. So in 1906, the Antiquities Act was signed by President Theodore Roosevelt, and that same year he designated Devil's Tower, El Morro, and Montezuma Castle national monuments. And then in 1907, Petrified Forest National Monument was designated. And these were still fairly small, I think, with the exception of Petrified Forest, which was about 60,000 acres. These were all in the 150, 200 acre range. So they were small enough that there wasn't a lot of controversy yet. But controversy started early. Grand Canyon National Monument was designated in 1908, and it was about 800,000 acres. And that was challenged legally by some mining interests, arguing that the canyon didn't count as an antiquity under the act. It wasn't, I think there are artifacts in the Grand Canyon, but, it was more of a geological feature than in antiquity. The Supreme Court disagreed and viewed the canyon as an unusual scientific interest, and that was the court case, which I think I mentioned here, Cameron v. United States. Grand Teton National Park, which I never considered controversial. If anybody's been there, there's a ton of people that visit every year. Same thing with Grand Canyon, which did become a national park later. But there's an interesting history behind that too, related to national monuments. Grand Teton National Park was designated in 1929, but it was smaller than it is now. Then 1943, Jackson Hole National Monument was established kind of adjacent to Grand Teton National Park. And there was a lot of local controversy related primarily over grazing and dude ranch rights. A lot of the locals are worried that they wouldn't be able to graze their cattle or run their operations. And that led to some fairly intense battles. And again, more court battles. The lower courts actually placed the burden on Congress to determine whether or not the president's authority was misused. Congress tried to abolish Jackson Hole National Monument. FDR actually PACO vetoed the bill, and then it was left, Congress retaliated by not funding it for 7 years. And then it was finally made a national park 7 years later in 1950, adding it on to the main portion of Grand Teton National Park by President Truman. There was a consequence to that, unfortunately, and it restricted the executive authority. Congress passed another bill that restricted, or I think it was actually an add-on to the bill that established the entirety of Grand Teton National Park, and it restricted the executive authority to designate national monuments in Wyoming. So only Congress can designate national monuments in Wyoming now. And this is where the timeline gets a little tricky. So I'm going to actually skip ahead to the next part, which is, I will explain a little bit. And I should have said 1971 to present. So I should give tribute to then Secretary Cecil Andrus from Idaho, who was Secretary of Interior under Carter at the time. So in 1971, the Alaska Native Settlements Claim passed, and that is a whole nother topic that relates and isn't related to national monuments. But under that act, it also authorized the Secretary of Interior to propose up to 80 million acres for preservation, and it gave 5 years for Congress to approve or disapprove it. That didn't happen within 5 years. So President Carter established 56 million acres or 17 national monuments in Alaska in 1978. And similar to the Grand Teton issue and the Grand Canyon issue, that was met with incredible backlash from a lot of locals, especially when it was viewed as an overreach of states' rights. And as a result of these battles, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which I think you can view as a success for sure, because 100 million acres of land were set aside and protected as national parks and monuments and other types of preserves as a result of this act. But again, there was a consequence to this action. And there was an add-on and a stipulation that after this passed, the president could not use the Antiquities Act to establish national monuments over 5,000 acres without congressional approval. And this brings us a little bit to the current controversies. National monuments weren't established very frequently post-Carter. Bush established a few national marine monuments, which were huge in size, but it was really an uptick in national monuments with Clinton and Obama. I believe Clinton designated 19 national monuments, including Grand Staircase Escalante. Obama designated 29 and enlarged 5. So this is where the controversy starts to come in. In 2017, Secretary of Interior, or the Department of Interior issued a review of national monuments that were designated after, I believe, 1996, or over 100,000 acres. And this is a list of the national monuments that were proposed for review. And the purpose of this review was to determine whether or not the designation or expansion of these national monuments, were compatible with that requirement that it was the smallest area needed to protect those areas, and 2, whether they actually protected historic or prehistoric structures, and they were scientific interests, and also whether or not adequate public outreach and coordination with relevant stakeholders were considered with these national monuments. And this was an interesting one. Craters of the Moon was on here. And I think that caused a little bit of confusion with Idahoans. But the most interesting part, which Dr. Freemuth pointed out to me, and he made it a little bit of a puzzle, he asked me what was wrong with this number, and I thought about it and I looked into it. So Craters of the Moon is actually both a national monument and preserve. And the chart to the left is just a history of when it's been preserved or at large or diminished. But in 2002, there was a redesignation on part of it to a national preserve, which would make the national monument part of that. That part is not a national monument. So technically the president can't undo something that Congress has already done. So that number was a little off, and I'm not sure the the Department of Interior realized that. In the end, it was only Bears Ears and Grand Staircase National Monument that were reduced. These are the previous boundaries. On the left is Grand Staircase. On the right is Bears Ears National Monument. And those boundaries, and we've talked about this in previous presentations, were reduced. Bears Ears was reduced about 85% or 1.3 million acres. Grand Staircase was reduced by almost 50%. The main arguments of the opponents of these national monuments that it was the land grab issue, although it should be noted that pre-existing uses were still allowed. I think there was at least one uranium mine still in Bears Ears. And this goes back to the primary controversy with the Antiquities Act today, whether or not the president has the authority to reduce monuments to this extent, especially, or completely abolish them under the Antiquities Act. And I'll talk a little bit, I skipped around a little bit, I'm sorry about that. So on the authority of the president to create national monuments, there's a little bit of mixed legal scholarship on this. I think most scholars agree that the president does have the authority to designate national monuments. And as we've seen just with the different examples of national monuments, it started out as a way to protect antiquities, especially Native American antiquities. It gradually grew to more geological features, and it expanded a little bit, and there have been court cases that have established this to wildlife and habitat, that those also count as significant scientific interests. What's a little unclear, and the court hasn't touched this yet, is whether or not the president has the authority to abolish national monuments or reduce them to this significance. There have been cases in the past where presidents have reduced national monuments. A lot of these have been either due to survey errors, they've been, fairly small. I think there was one that was at least 100,000 acres. But another point is that they haven't been reduced by a president since about 1960. The Antiquities Act has usually only been used to expand national monuments. So we'll see if the court touches this. There are lawsuits, as mentioned by previous presenters. I think Glenn Nessifer mentioned about 3 lawsuits that are ongoing with Bears Ears National Monument and Grand Staircase. So we'll see if the court touches it. I'm not 100% sure what will happen with that. So some themes and takeaways. A lot of the controversies that relate to national monuments have to do with multiple use conflicts. And Craters of the Moon is actually a really good example of this. There's been multiple proposals to turn Craters of the Moon into a national monument, which the proposed legislation has always been just a name change. It wouldn't change the way it's managed, including existing grazing allotments. And my understanding is that primarily farming interests have been concerned that it would impact, what type of hay could be driven through the highway there. Again, grazing allotment changes, those are unfounded, but the fear is still there. The extent of executive authority, as I previously mentioned, the Antiquities Act is fairly vague in how it's interpreted, and the court has not touched whether or not the president can reduce national monuments under the Antiquities Act. I can say my personal opinion, I think the act was pretty clear that it was meant to establish national monuments, not get rid of national monuments, and that authority probably should rest with Congress. But again, that hasn't been established with court cases yet. And again, the interpretation of the Antiquities Act has really expanded in the last 100 plus years. And it historically wasn't really used to protect biodiversity, but that's becoming more of an interest, especially under a lot of the monuments that President Obama designated, like Cascade Siskiyou National Monument. I think you could say in Oregon, that's the first national monument that really focused on biodiversity as a scientific interest. It'll be really telling in the future of who's in charge. Unfortunately, I think there, as we've seen as a reoccurring theme in this class, there's been an increasing divide over Democrats and Republicans on how they treat national monuments in protected areas. I don't think it has to be that way, but if you look at the current election, there's a pretty clear divide, even with national monuments on versus oil and gas interests and other extractive uses. I think Biden has said that he would reverse the Trump executive order reducing Bears Ears. I'm not 100% sure about Grand Staircase Escalante, but I assume he meant that as well. And there's a question of whether or not the court will actually make a decision on whether or not the president can use the Antiquities Act to reduce national monuments. And I knew I tried to talk fast, so I knew I would be under time. So I would encourage you guys to pay attention to the news going forward. I noticed there's a lot of increased news coverage of national monuments, especially Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, but sometimes also even in Idaho with Craters of the Moon and becoming a national monument or a national park. And then there's other court cases that may have an impact, such as the recent Oklahoma Supreme Court case on tribal authority. So I would encourage you guys to pay attention to the news. This, I think, will be a hot topic going forward, which might be good or bad for national monuments. I personally think it's great that they're actually getting attention now, and I think they have wide public support. Okay, well, I actually have a lot of time for questions. Kind of zoomed through that. I didn't want to go too much into the legal battle since it's complicated even for me. There's a reason I didn't go into law. Do I have questions? Why hasn't any of the national monuments in Idaho become a national park? I think I answered that a little bit, and that was from Alyssa. Do you want to ask or expand on that?
Yeah, you did answer it kind of about the Craters of the Moon, specifically the farmer interest about driving through there. But I actually had a follow-up question. You just briefly mentioned how Biden would want to reduce, take away the reduction on Bears Ears.
Yeah, I guess reverse.
Wondering if you know anything about the leases, the oil and gas leases that were created after it's been reduced, and what would happen with those after it's been, expanded again with the new swing, if there is.
That's a good question. So I think it's administered by the BLM. There's another separate issue where the current BLM director is technically supposed to be ousted from his job, but he's been sticking around. So there are so those decisions might be just made, but I don't think I'm not sure if any of the oil and gas decisions were made under him. So that's a good question. I would assume that if it's an existing oil and gas lease, that it might be grandfathered in. I think the current laws just say that establish that no new oil and gas leases can be established with national monuments. But there also haven't been many takers on some of those leases, because I don't think uranium mining is exactly, and oil and gas drilling is exactly a booming business right now. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure. It's a good question. I think it would be a mess for the BLM to deal with, to be honest.
Yeah, I remember John talking about something, how like people would purposely buy them up because they knew that they would have to be compensated if it expands again, if the government wants to buy it back. But I wasn't sure if you've known anything like that had occurred or whatnot.
Yeah, I think my guess is that they would be grandfathered in, but I think it's a political question too. And there's some, like I said, there are some other laws about oil and gas leases. I don't think any new oil and gas leases could be established, but it would also depend on what some of the lawsuits established. If they threw out the previous reduction as illegitimate, again, I'm not a legal expert, so I'm hoping I'm not getting this wrong. I would assume that any oil and gas leases established or land sales or new grazing allotments would be considered invalid as well.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm not a legal expert on this either, so I don't have a clarification to enter, but I do want to say that Mackenzie and I have listed a film on the syllabus called Bitter 70 that is actually about a protester. I bet Leif has seen the movie already, but you can access it through the library. So it's a documentary about an activist who actually went to oil and gas leases in Utah and bid on them, even though he couldn't pay for them. And then he became a felon and was thrown in jail for, I think, 2.5 years. And so it's the story of how he participated in that process. It walks you through how the process works and how you get a bidding number and kind of what he did. So it's a enlightening kind of look at who does have a say and why they do and what happens when an environmental activist becomes a felon, right? So there's this sort of piece of it that's really personable. So I'd encourage you, if that's an interest, Alyssa, to check out that film. We had it in the syllabus, but it eventually got bumped down to the list of recommended things at the end, but the's a link to the library where you can watch that.
Awesome, thank you. I'll check it out.
Yeah, it's an entertaining film anyway. There have been a couple questions about the role of the Supreme Court and asking you to sort of think about what the Supreme Court rules on the Antiquities Act might be with the current changes to the Supreme Court, and if that might be a way of taking land back for expansion and mining. So do you have any predictions on the Supreme Court here?
Let's see, I could go back to my political science 101 classes, but I can't see them touching it yet. I think they tend not to take on highly political cases. And I didn't mention all the court cases in lower courts and the Supreme Court that have been related to national monuments, but at the very least, it's been established that the president can designate national monuments, as well as that interpretation of the scientific and historical values. I forgot which court case it was, but there was a court case that established, and I think it was I forgot which national monument it was. I think it was Death Valley before it became a national park, but there was a watering hole, and I think it was a rancher argued that he should be able to use it for his cattle, and there was an endangered fish, and I think it was a lower district court did agree that wildlife and habitat count as scientific interests. So I don't know. That one's hard to predict, but I do think that with the question of whether or not a president can reduce national monuments, there's the precedence issue. Presidents have done it before, but a lot of those were a long time ago, and it's a highly political issue. And my understanding of the Supreme Court is they tend to avoid those and let the lower courts figure them out. But it's a good question, especially with the switch and balance now. I think it'll be interesting to watch if it does come up. Certainly. And as you said, with the court in Montana ruling that the acting director of BLM is illegitimate, how did the courts weigh in is an interesting one. So let's go to Stephanie's question now about presidential power. And I'll let you ask it, Stephanie, but if Mackenzie, in your answer, if you could also talk a little bit about what the significance for monuments is being created by a president versus being created by Congress. Is there sort of an lesson citizens should know about the distinction there?
Sure. Yeah, I was just curious. It seemed like from the readings that most of the designations have come from presidential decisions. So I was just curious, like how often historically these designations are made by Congress. And was there another part to my question? No, I guess that's it.
I don't think it's been that many. I was trying to figure that out before I did this presentation. I couldn't find an answer. I think Congress usually just reestablishes, like in the instance of craters, reestablishes those boundaries and basically legitimizes them. Yeah, I think it's primarily been used by presidents, especially when you consider that if that power exists with a president, and it's easier to use than going through Congress. And what was the other part of the question? What's the distinction between the two and the importance of that?
Well, why does it matter that it was created by Congress or by the president? So what's the significance?
Well, I think it relates back to that ongoing struggle, with that perception of states' rights versus the federal government, especially in Western states. We're constantly seeing conflicts over what's considered a land grab or more restrictions on federal land. So I do think that national monuments tend to be more controversial than something that Congress supports, just because it can be done without public support. And I think a lot of national monuments have been designated in, the last term of a president's last term. And, so he's not losing any political capital there. I think that happened with on Obama. It was during, I think the last few months of his term that he designated quite a few of those national monuments. I do think that, there are, at least with recent national monuments, there have been discussions with different stakeholder groups. So I think that's a misconception that they're just designated without any, maybe in the past that's happened way in the past before, the early 1900s without any collaboration with local stakeholders. But I think the difference with Congress is, especially in recent times when there is more divide between Democrats and Republicans, most national or protected areas bills tend to be bipartisan and are pretty widely supported and not controversial. I think there'll always be controversy when a protected area is designated. But I think that's the main difference, is there tends to be more controversy just because the symbolic idea of the president being able to protect land that technically was already protected as federal land.
But in a different form. Yeah.
In a different form.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. So I'm a friend of Emily's. I teach at Western Washington University. And so you'll see my colleague Xander and I show up at a couple of these because the topic is really near and dear to both of our hearts. And both Xander and I are sort of scholars in public lands. And so Emily and Mackenzie, thank you for curating this and allowing us to sit in. To follow up on what Mackenzie said, this is what I've really been ruminating on the last few months in terms of how one's vote really matters, in the sense that for the most part, people really support the idea of conservation, whether that's through national parks or national monuments. And so if you have a vote and you can support candidates who are also not really about preservation and like, let's set aside everything for wilderness, but for conservation and for protection to some degree, because national parks and recreation are so critical to the West and to America. I think that's one of the places where we actually see quite a bit of agreement among different user groups. I mean, you'll have hunters and whitewater kayakers wanting the same thing. And what they want is really access to resources. And they, I remember taking like a poli-sci class in college, decades ago, and really hearing about the term strange bedfellows. And it kind of applies here because, like I said, you'll have, hunters and backcountry folks and anglers really on the same page as environmentalists. And they're groups that you might not think otherwise would agree, but what they have is really a commitment to natural resources and public lands. So that's just a really roundabout way of saying that I think in general, the public really supports public lands, and the people who really want to do the drilling and the extraction, it's a very rich and powerful kind of small number, but like the movie that Emily had described, individuals can make a difference. So I'm trying to find hope and trying to get through the next few weeks and just trying to think of ways of public lands and the things that the Westerners care about. So that's a really roundabout way of saying it, but I mean, people generally support public lands, and just keep it on with your, senators and representatives about protecting public lands.
Well said. Yeah, no, I thought it was really, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but looking at, there was a public comment period for the National Monuments Review in 2017, and most of them were not in favor of reducing national monuments at all. I forgot what the statistic was, but I want to say 90% at least.
Yeah, and we've seen this thread in other ways, saying it, Grace, but there is this really overwhelming land that is in common, right, and common support of it. But how that gets trickled into the political system, it then becomes watered down in significant ways. Vote, make heard, do all of these things. I'd like to ask the students something and take Alyssa's question about why haven't Idaho's national monuments become national park, and turn that on you guys for a minute. And I'd love to hear from you why you think it hasn't, because it is pretty pretty unique to have a state with more wilderness than anywhere else, but no national parks except for that tiny sliver of Yellowstone. So I'm curious if any of the students would be willing to offer an explanation for why that could be. Chris, go for it.
All right. When Grace was talking, she mentioned, your vote. And ultimately what I think it is values. So what we value as personally, it might form into a public movement. But as far as craters of the moon, I don't think there's a whole lot of public down there. I don't know if I'm wrong, but it is an interesting place, very interesting. But I think it was more. So is Craters of the Moon a national monument or?
A national monument and preserve. So. And there's
okay,
wilderness on top of that too.
So maybe it's political will that was lacking down there, and political will from another place that enabled that, or lack of resistance to that. I'm not sure.
So Chris's point, and I'm going to manipulate Alyssa's question a little bit more and ask you to imagine, right? So what if Craters of the Moon was a national park? What if the Sawtooth Recreation Area was a national park? What if Boulder White Clouds, any of those were a national? What would be different in our state if that change happened?
Does it have to do with use? Not necessarily a national park compared to a national monument, but just compared to BLM land or just public lands, the ability to go hunt and fish and hike and all. I mean, you can hike in national parks, but that kind of use?
Perhaps, yeah, I don't have an answer that I'm necessarily looking for. So I think that that's certainly part of it, right? What else?
If I could add to that, it just like I would.
It is your question after all, Alyssa. Yeah.
Interest groups. Like, what are the majority of interest groups around that area? And what Mackenzie kind of spoke to were the farmers. And so what they're doing in that area, how would it be affecting? How's it affecting them? And they're going to have that voice. And I know John kind of talked about this subject briefly, and I think they have made the big decision, the ranchers and farmers in that area not wanting that tourism and not wanting to be limited and driving through there and whatnot with certain plants, hay.
I can chime in with a little insight on that.
Please, yes.
The national park proposal actually does have a lot of local support with, I think, ARCO primarily. There's not a lot of people there, but it would boost tourism, or they want it to boost tourism because there's really not a lot of industry left in ARCO. And I think looping back to what Grace said, my understanding of the Craters issue is back to powerful lobbying groups like the Farm Bureau, similar lobbying groups that are a lot more powerful than a really tiny town in Idaho.
And so it's this really interesting contradiction of multiple use, right? So agricultural are win out over tourism, recreational ones, right? And that ties to Stephanie's point about youth, right? But it also has to do a lot of growth development for the state and what types of development are prioritized. And it's also very much tied, I would say, a sort of cultural understanding of whether or not to bring more people into the state, right? Or to sort of keep them out. And I think that's one of the ways that's factored into the debate of whether a national park, right? A national park opens up Idaho to everyone. And many people with Idaho would rather leave it for Idahoans, whatever that means, right? And so there's this interesting mine or yours aspect of it as well. Daniel, you had a great question about biodiversity, and there were others we haven't gotten to. If other people, thank you for indulging me on that thought exercise. But let's go to a couple more questions from Mackenzie.
My main question was, do you feel like protection for biodiversity is beyond the scope of the Antiquities Act? And if so, is there the need to create another presidential power to reserve things for biodiversity, mainly so the public knows that that's the reason, and it can draw attention to the fact that the wildlife needs to be saved?
Well, I personally don't disagree. I don't agree that biodiversity is outside the scope of the Antiquities Act. I think the number of monuments that have been designated, and I don't have a number off the top of my head, but if you read some of the proclamations, a lot of times they'll have a list of wildlife, and legal challenges of established that wildlife count as a scientific interest. And I think I would consider wildlife and biodiversity a pretty significant scientific interest. So no, I don't agree that, I don't think that it's outside the scope of the Antiquities Act. Maybe the Antiquities Act, it's hard to say what the Teddy Roosevelt was thinking. He obviously protected very small areas that were artifacts, especially Native American artifacts, and then later designated the Grand Canyon. I should read a little bit more about his thought process, but obviously the interpretation has been expanded and consistently, and only Congress really has, my opinion, if they want to change the Antiquities Act, they would have to do it. I don't think they should. I think the Antiquities Act might be used less often in the future, depending on who's in charge. But I think it can be an important tool to protect biodiversity, indirectly or directly. I think there've probably been a lot of national monuments. Just speaking in terms of biodiversity, I don't think that's a topic. I don't even think that's a really sexy topic that, people who like public lands talk about a lot. It's usually, large megafauna or scenery. but I think it's a tool that can be used, when there isn't another tool such as congressional protection available.
Do you think it would maybe be helpful to create a different designation to draw attention to the fact that the biodiversity is the reason for designating this area as protected?
Well, like I said, with the exception of one national monument, which I think is Cascade-Siskiyou, I can't really think of a national monument that was specifically or predominantly for biodiversity. So I can't think of another designation type that would work, since we already have national wildlife refuges. There are state designations like wildlife management areas. I just working in protected lands and having to map them out for a living. I personally don't want any more designations. So it's getting
okay.
But no, I think there are quite a wide variety of designation types. There's wilderness. I think it's worth thinking about, as land planners, people in politics, conservationists, and then people in wanting to preserve cultural artifacts as well, how we approach these issues and where we protect. I think that's one of the really interesting dichotomies of public land is, it's not just biodiversity, it's not just natural resources, it's also cultural resources. So I think we have to, in planning for the future, I think we have to approach both.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Great question, Daniel. And I'm going to weigh in here for a minute before I go to Brendan with his question. But and that's just because biodiversity has been such an important scientific concept for protecting the Amazon, for example, and protecting tropical places. But in some ways, it doesn't work well in the temperate world, because most of the places that are already protected or constituents argue need to be protected are biologically depauperate. Right? They have so few species that that's not a measure that will give them any leverage or any sort of cultural sway. So, there are other ways of sort of describing the value of the sage grouse, for example, right? Its rarity, its uniqueness, it's crazy lek dance and, all of these attributes of it, but it's not biodiversity. And so you have such a great line of questioning. And it's one that I've explored in South America a lot, because in some ways, the translation of a really complicated scientific term like biodiversity has had greater political sway in tropical countries, where it actually does justify protecting the jungle, which for so long was there to be trashed, right? And so it's sort of this flip where these majestic landscapes in the US West aren't biodiverse. So you really can't justify them being protected through that logic. And so you have to, like Mackenzie said, extend a cultural aspect, which wilderness has always been cultural anyway, but you have to give an explanation that incorporates that piece of it. And really the scenery, the monumentalism of the landscape, and the emotions and the feelings, right? All of these soft and squishy and fuzzy, but super important emotions that people have can justify it, but they're harder to legally describe than science, right? And so here we have that sort of pendulum swinging from science influencing policy to actually thinking about, as a community, whether at the national level or the local level, why these landscapes matter and what's so significant about them. So great question. Thank you for indulging me in the tangent. And Brendan, you had some specific questions about removal and reduction. We could go there next.
Yeah, I'm just going to sell this and have to run out really quick. Are there, to put it kind of bluntly, are there any public lands areas that are kind of on the government's shit list, as it were, where they're being considered for removal or reduction of size because they're unpopular or for other reasons?
I think there are, it depends on the year. I mean, I think there are always protected areas, national monuments on the radar. Again, I think, yeah, I can't think of one. I think there's so many other political things going on right now with COVID and, the election. I can't think of one that's currently on the radar. And I think that in that 2017 review, obviously, I think the Department of Interior recognized that doing more than reducing Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante would have probably backfired even more than it did. I don't have an analysis in front of me, but there have been, I think there is an increase in pushing for oil and gas development, like in Alaska, for example. So I think there are, things that aren't quite visible from the media, or if you're just a person from general public, they aren't quite as visible, just because they're so administrative that are happening. But yeah, it's pretty, BLM lands, they're disposed in small amounts and traded in like all the time, but it's pretty rare that it's a large piece of land.
Well, and to follow up on Mackenzie is, it's not a national monument, but the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge right now, which has just been, I've been teaching public lands now for almost 25 years. And I just keep thinking, every few years, and like you said, Mackenzie, it really depends on the presidency. During the Obama administration, I didn't have to teach lessons on, what happens if the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is drilled. And then, in 2016, suddenly, my pedagogy changes with like, okay, let's think of activities on the stakeholders if ANWR is going to be drilled. And it's really just been this up and down process that is so, it seems, the Arctic seems really, really remote for most people in the lower 48 states. But in fact, part of that political argument is, energy independence. And I think it's a specious argument because there's so much else going on at play, but it's an example of an area, even though it's a national monument, that is under threat. So it's just, as a professor, Emily and I, and, hopefully Mackenzie and Xander in the future when we're teaching this, it's like public lands will always be a topic. And depending on the administration, there will always be something to talk about, which just, again, reflects the value and how deeply held people feel about public lands.
Well, and frankly, I've been surprised there hasn't been more pushback on the marine designations. And to me, that says that they're just not effective. They're not doing a whole lot, so that's a big piece of it. But, that has been a tremendous shift in the last 10 to 15 years, and the size of them, the accounting for them. And I think it's in line with where a lot of our students are in terms of what they care about, right, in the ocean and those pieces of it, but that they haven't been more controversial has been sort of surprising to me. Alyssa Zapata, I think you're still here. I didn't mean to neglect your question. You had a great one before. Let's go there and then see if anybody else has any concluding questions.
Yeah, so in one of the articles, John mentioned how future monument designations will only succeed if federal agencies communicate widely in advance with community and politicians to confirm that the support is there. But in other cases, when there is no support from the community or politicians, what happens then? Like, will they still push for the designation, or I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we've seen that happen before. What was I think it was our previous speaker who mentioned that the Antiquities Act can sometimes be used as a tool to start discussions. I believe that, there were talks of being the Bowler White Clouds area, a national monument, and then Congress and local groups got together and they discussed actually how to make that protection work as a wilderness area. So I do think he was right. With any protected area, there has to be conversations with the community, and that includes all parts of the community, including Indigenous people, which I think one of the big criticisms with Bears Ears and Grand Staircase was with the reduction, they were barely communicated with, or they weren't listened to. So I think there has to be a balance. And, with national monuments and any protected area designations, there's always going to be somebody that's not happy. And I think John has said this and others have said this, if you get if nobody's 100% happy, that means that there was some sort of collaboration and the right thing was done. So yeah, I think especially with presidents that are in their first terms, using the Antiquities Act, I think this is why it seems like they tend to use it, especially lately in their later terms, unless it's a very non-controversial national monument, especially like some of the historical national monuments that are basically buildings and like civil rights monuments. Not very many people are opposed to that, luckily. I think they would use some political capital. They would lose a lot of political capital if there was a large monument designation. But going back to what Grace said, I think people have to be vocal and voting. So I think the burden also falls on the community to get involved. So if you are a conservationist or, you're a recreationist or, anybody who uses public lands is concerned about them and wants certain areas protected in general, you have to be part of that conversation. I'm not sure in the future if presidents will try to use the Antiquities Act to reduce national monuments. I was kind of surprised by the Trump thing, to be honest, but I think he set the precedent that somebody can. So I would hope that doesn't happen again, but that's where the courts might come in. And then Congress could always abolish national monuments as well. I think I think it was Stephanie asked the question, how often is historically established or modified monuments? And I can post this link in the chat. There's a National Park Service website that I've used quite a bit. Unfortunately, it goes only up to 2006, but it lists all the expansions and reductions. And most of the time, Congress has either redesignated or slightly modified boundaries. So like turned it into a national park, or in a really interesting case, I didn't realize that Minidoka National Monument in Idaho wasn't a national monument anymore. It's a National Historic Site, but more land was added to it. So it was kind of a roundabout way of answering your question and a lot of questions. But did that?
Well, and I think it's an interesting question because it gets at the idea of scale that we've talked about in other ways, right? And so you can think about something like the Boise foothills, right? Which was a local initiative, locally protected. And there is, like a piece of what's really public land that's paid for through our taxes initiatives that are all entirely local, right? All the way up to sort of a national park as the crown jewel of what a public land designation is and everything in between, right? So National Historic Sites, National Monuments, BLM and Forest Service land, we've heard a lot about. Each of these protections has a different implication. And it also brings with it a different audience. And who that what their interests are versus who was there before are part of the conversation around that designation, or they should be at this day and time. They weren't always historically, right? But they should be sort of going forward and first kind of thinking about how it's distributed and where they don't reach and what the cultural implications of those pieces are as well. Yeah. Are there any other questions, other comments or observations? Usually, Lily, I let Mackenzie get the last question in, but since she presented today, we won't go to her. And if none of our other guests have another question, then we'll rejoin on Friday. We will again be online. So Rick Johnson, who was the head of the Idaho Conservation League for 35 years or so, will be talking to us about the Boulder White Cloud. So we'll look at having that. The link is in Zoom. And please join me in giving a loud or quiet round of applause to Mackenzie for a great presentation today. Thank you, everyone. And we'll stay on the line if people have questions going forward. Otherwise, we'll see you on Friday. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Grace.
Thanks, Grace. To see you too.
We have a lot of students on.
I actually had a question still.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Story,
you were Oh boy, it might have escaped me. You were just saying that there was like a chance that the Supreme Court could just completely wash away with national monuments. I mean, not like a chance, but you were saying like, I mean, there was a bunch of different possibilities of different presidencies are coming in and changing, sizes or various different things. And you kind of touched on the fact that, or just an idea that they could do away with them.
It wouldn't be doing away with them. I think the main question that's still lingering on the legal side of things is whether or not the president can either abolish national monuments. So, by executive order, taking a national monument and saying it no longer exists. And in which case it would just revert back to whatever previous designation it was, or reducing the boundaries as much as they have been. So I think that would be the main question, is what that the Supreme Court would have to decide is what is the authority under the Antiquities Act? Is it to only establish, or is it also to reduce or abolish a specific national monument? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Does that help answer your question?
Yes, it did. Because when you first said that, I was like, whoa.
No,
I got you though.
Only Congress could get rid of the Antiquities Act by creating something else or modifying it.
Okay.
It's an important question, right? Though it also dovetails what Steve Ellis was talking about in terms of how do you make a management plan that spans longer than a political term, right? Or
Right.
how do you sort of adjust when the ecological scales aren't in sync with political cycles, and if you had the case where a president undid everything that came before him in the previous term, right? Like, what are the implications of that for the sage grouse, the forests, the sort of larger picture? And I think that makes it a really important question, right? Who should get to decide and how, but then what are the planning implications for long-term planning that's necessary for taking appropriate care of wetland fire or, invasive species or any of these issues that don't sort of stop for an election?
Yeah, at the very least, I don't feel bad for the BLM, or I feel bad for the BLM employees who, had to make a new management plan for Bears Ears and Grand Staircase. And then maybe we'll have to do it again. That's a lot of work. Takes away from resources from other issues.